Edie and Will, as we've been reporting, there was no shortage of controversy or anger leading up to Congressman King's hearings on the radicalization of Islam. Many thought it was a witch hunt. Our next guest disagrees. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is a self-described devout Muslim, and he testified at those hearings today. Dr. Jasser, thank you for joining us.
It's nice to be with you. Thanks for having me, Elliot.
Well, look, a lot of, and I've just got to put this out there, a lot of devout Muslims think that this hearing is painting with such a broad brush and it perpetuates ugly stereotypes. You disagree, obviously. Explain why.
Well, I think it's an opportunity. I think that if you look, the negative perceptions of Islam have doubled over the past 3 or 4 years alone. If we look at terror arrests of the last 220, 180 have been Muslims, so somewhere we're failing. And I think this is the fact that it was all Muslims there tells America that we are Muslims who want to solve this, and we're the only ones who can solve it. So has our country become so polarized and so paralyzed that we cannot focus on a problem and say, yeah, there may be other forms of extremism, but at this point we have to walk back. You know, it's not just that final step of violence. You have to walk back radicalization over years and figure out where it starts and how to get Muslim youth identifying with this culture.
Dr. Jasser, you talked a little bit about that root cause of radicalization. In fact, you said in the past that our conversation has myopically focused on jihadism and violent extremism, but that we need to talk more about the concept of Islamism, which you call political Islam. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And importantly for me, how widespread is Islamism in the United States?
Well, that's a great question, and that's where we need the government's help for resources to help have a public-private partnership to figure that out. But political Islam is the sense that, well, all laws come from Islam, that government is not under God or based on individual rights. It's based on rights that are given from Islam, and thus law is based on Sharia or Islamic law. I think pervasively in the Islamic community, that's about maybe 20–30% felt that way. And if you look in Egypt or in the Middle East, the Brotherhood is about 20–30%. And the Brotherhood is the main organization globally that promotes that idea. They have, not by coincidence, hatched most of the radical groups in the world. But remember, we're defining radicalism as violence. It's not just violence, it's an ideology. When Muslims are told by their families or by their imam that this society is not Islamic, but we live here because it gives us rights, but ideally we want to create Islamic states, it disenfranchises them.
You know, I don't think that Muslims are the only ones certainly out there that are looking at things as a Muslim first and perhaps other things second. I call it hyphenated Americans, where you're something first and, oh yeah, and I'm an American also. What do we do to counter that? You say that, you know, you want that. A lot of people do. How do you go into the community and help people think of themselves as Americans first and whatever else they happen to be second?
That is such a great question. As we saw in the Middle East, the revolution spread through communication, and we've not been engaging our immigrants with the ideologies of Americanism. We've just sort of been letting them live here, and we've not been promoting the ideas that my family came and embraced and sought to embody in our practices. And I was raised believing that I could practice my faith more freely in America than anywhere else in the world. That mantra is not being taught to a lot of Muslim youth that end up going down the slope of radicalization. You
know, Doctor, I thought I heard Newt Gingrich the other day invoking God and saying that all rights devolve from God just the other day, so I'm not so sure this is an idea or an issue that's isolated to what you're viewing as radical Islam. But, you know, I want to know what your sense of the 20 to 30% is. Where does that come from? And when you say 20 to 30% of those who are Islamic or believe in the Islamic faith in the United States believe in political Islam, are you suggesting 20 to 30% of those who are Islamic in the United States don't believe in separation of church and state? Because that is completely contrary to every piece of data I've ever seen. So what is your source of this 20 to 30%?
Well, again, I don't know what data you've seen. We have to make sure we're clear what we're talking about. If we're talking about violence, it's only 3 to 5% that believe they should do that violently. But if we're talking about those that want the Islamic State the Pew poll, for example, said that there was a Pew poll that looked at Muslims that said that they were Muslim first. 47% said they were Muslim first, and it also looked at how much they wanted Islamic law in government, etc. Now, the exact numbers, as I told you, it hasn't been studied appropriately. So at the end of the day, I don't know. I'm using numbers extrapolating from Egypt, extrapolating from my own experience, but we have to study this because that's the ideology.
Doctor, I'm just trying to make sure we understand the numbers and understand the phrasing and what you mean, because the risk of generalization here is so enormous. I think we could all appreciate that when you start painting with a broad brush about ethnicities and you start saying they believe in this or they believe in that, that's going down a very dangerous road. So I think we need to be careful in how we use these phrases and also where the numbers come from. And I think I just heard you saying the 20 to 30% was an extrapolation from Egypt. Did I hear you say that?
It's an extrapolation from my experience in mosques, from my experience talking to Muslims in universities, etc. And where we've studied it is abroad. Pew did a study in Egypt and in Indonesia, and actually even abroad, those numbers, for example, can get higher when you ask them, do you want Islam in government? Some of those societies
Doctor, not to interrupt, that data is from Egypt and Indonesia, not the United States.
Again, I would tell you that we need to study that in the United States.
Right.
Nobody has studied it appropriately.
So
and I'm telling you, as a Muslim, when I run up against people that don't want to reform, this is my experience, and we need to study it.
So that 20 to 30% number you used wasn't based on data you're extrapolating from the United States?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, Dr. Jasser, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
It's a pleasure to be with you.